I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Welcome back to another episode of the Time for Teachership podcast. This is episode 204, and we are continuing in a mini-series from our last episode where we're discussing supporting students to critically analyze power dynamics. And in the last episode, I shared some frameworks and some examples of how to analyze gender in your class because I used to teach an intersectional gender studies class. And so I gave a high school example and an elementary example and a specific framework as well as specific activities. So please feel free to go back to that one if you have not already. After this, you do not need to see them in order, but I do want to give a quick reminder if you didn't listen or if you did and it's been a while. From the last episode, we went through kind of the four main steps that I would use if I were to kind of lay out this activity or set of activities for students. So the very first thing I would do is to find a theory or framework for analyzing, something that's out in the literature, something that works for you. The next thing I would do is break it down. So simplify the language in the theory or framework. Often they use very academic language, and either simplify the language or condense the number of attributes if needed. Older students or students who maybe have a lot of English proficiency, they might not need it. But if they need it to the point where having the original language is a barrier to understanding an application, like we want to make sure that it is usable. That's the priority because the critical thinking can come even if they don't have the very super high academic language. For example, in Nussbaum's theory in gender, the last episode, she uses the word like fungibility, which I had to look up. I had no idea, right? And so I needed simpler language to be able to apply it myself. Our students may need that as well. So simplify if needed. And then step 3 is to invite students to apply it using modern, interesting media, something that is hyper engaging, and then hang the visual reminder of the framework like an anchor chart in the class, and then invite application to course content or text like historical sources, a novel you're reading with the class, something that might be a little lower interest to students, or like not all students are hyper engaged, but now that they've done something with really interesting media and they've applied the framework and talked about it with high interest, they can use it in other situations. So that's a very fast reminder of those kind of basic steps. And now I'm going to talk you through some examples of frameworks you could use. Specifically, I want to talk about frameworks that could relate to race and racialization, nation, and pieces like that. I think you could also use this first one. I'm going to talk through Iris Young's 5 Faces of Oppression framework, which is also very useful, I think, for gender or class, or I haven't really thought through it for all axes of identity, but I think you could use it in a lot of different spaces. For today, we'll just kind of think about it through the lens of racialization and nation. So Iris Young's 5 Faces of Oppression, I will link to this as well as other resources that I name throughout the episode in today's blog post. So if you want to follow along or make a note of it to come back to later, feel free. I will link to all the resources that I'm naming. That's going to be at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/204. Okay. So Iris Young's 5 Faces of Oppression. I'll link to a shortened adapted version of her article, but basically the 5 pieces are exploitation. So this is using people's labor to make money without paying them fairly. Right? Exploitation. The second is marginalization. So society decides that it can't or won't use groups of people even for labor. So yes, we're going to use people for labor without paying them fairly. We're going to exploit them. But you know what? Some groups of people, we're just not even going to use them for labor. We're going to exclude them, which ultimately will probably lead to their like major lack of resources and sickness, illness, potentially even death, right? This is like marginalization. We're pushing people to the margins. So we have exploitation, marginalization. The third is powerlessness. This is where groups are actively removed and kept away from the power to make decisions. They are treated disrespectfully. It ultimately may create a culture of silence in the group that has been like removed from power or denied access to power, I should say, to the point where this group may not even talk about oppression, perhaps because they can't, because of the dynamics, it's dangerous to.
or because like there's so many dehumanizing messages being sent to this group that they feel powerlessness, right? I think in the four eyes of oppression framework, they talk about internalized oppression, and this is kind of where that comes to bear. The fourth component of her five faces of oppression is the culture of imperialism. So this is where the culture of a dominant group is kind of treated as normal and expects everyone else to communicate and think and value the same things in the same ways as them. Everyone else is kind of stereotyped as other, right? So that's a culture of imperialism. And then the fifth one is violence. So physical attacks on people or property, which is intended to harm or humiliate people or groups of people. So again, those five: exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, culture of imperialism, and violence. And now, if I were to do this with high school, I might keep those words the same. If I have students who are brand new to English, or if I have students who maybe are younger, I might just simplify that language a little bit. So feel free to do this however you would like. Here's how I just quickly kind of took a look at it and reconceived it a bit. I would actually condense it to four instead of five components. And here's what I would name them. One is take away power. So again, that idea of powerlessness, I like the idea of take away power because you are kind of centering the actors or the people, the groups who are removing actively power from people. It's not that people are innately powerless. So I would want to make sure that we would name that. And you might notice that in my gender episode last week, I said powerless was kind of a category that I used with students, and I've been thoughtful about that. So that's maybe one thing I would do as a reframe if I were to do that piece again. So take away power. I think exploitation I would call use as tools, right? So you're using human beings as tools. You're exploiting them. You're seeing them as a tool or like physical property. I think that kind of gets at the heart of exploitation and is a little bit easier linguistically. Physically harm or violence you could keep. I could think you could also do physically harm. And then I would combine probably culture of imperialism and marginalization for simplicity. And I think the kind of category that both of those fall under is exclude or other. I might do like exclude slash other. And so we're just basically saying that people are kind of pushed to the side. They are excluded from kind of the dominant ways of being and thinking, access to resources that the dominant group gets. They are othered, like they're stereotyped in their kind of ways of being and thinking are kind of otherized. So exclude, other, whatever feels best linguistically for your students. And then once I have that framework in place, here's what I would invite students to do. I would invite students to use this as a lens to analyze either a historical source or an event in history. I might use it to analyze a current event, something that's happening now. So I know some teachers in the middle school level use like CNN 10, I think it's called, just some sort of, or like Newsella, some sort of video or article that's going to inform students about current events. If you already have that as part of your practice, what a beautiful way to kind of layer in this framework to more critically analyze power dimensions and dynamics. You could use it to analyze characters or events in a story or a novel that you're reading, a picture book that you're reading with younger students, or in other media that students might be aware of. Again, we're talking about high interest media when you first initially talk about this. So I would even bring in, like movies, TV shows, music videos, whatever it is that students are interested in at the moment, any sort of like social media trend, and invite that lens to be applied to that high interest thing. Now, I think a second part of this, so we can like identify the oppression. And again, I think I mentioned this in the last episode on gender. We want to not just stop at identifying oppression, but kind of move towards envisioning a better future and actively countering the stereotypes. So one of the things that I thought about was NYU has a great culturally responsive curriculum scorecard to evaluate curriculum. I'm wondering about using some of that because what they did to create that is they looked at a bunch of different frameworks and things that are out there and then they synthesized. So using that synthesis to kind of bring the pieces, the categories that they came up with into an analytical framework for students, I think might be a useful practice. And so two that I would pull out. One is diverse and accurate representation. So inviting students to analyze stories, for example, for representation, both diverse representation as well as accurate representation, which means that there are no kind of stereotypes of identities. There's no tokenism where we just kind of put this character in the story gave them this identity just to kind of check a box, but they actually have like full, rich lives and agency, right? People must have agency when we are talking about diverse and accurate representation. That is key. Right? And then I think the second thing I would pull from NYU's culturally responsive scorecard is that we want storylines and kind of historical players, if we're talking about like not nonfiction, right? Like historical events and people, we want them to invert power dynamics, traditional power dynamics. So what that means is that we want stories or the collection of events and people we're looking at in history to center and value people, assets, and perspectives that have been marginalized by groups in power. So if we have identified in a source or a series of events in history a form of oppression, such as marginalization, then we want to, as the teacher, but also as students, we want to be looking for texts and inquiring about stories and sources that are actually going to give us the perspective of whoever has been missing or marginalized in the original text we looked at, right? So I think there's like the counter to what we saw in oppression is like what's possible in this NYU framework. So again, diverse and accurate representation, as well as inverting power dynamics, are the things that we want to see. And so we may find them and celebrate them in certain texts. We may say we want them and we want to research and seek them out, or we may just pose a question about like, I'm not seeing this. There is a lack here. Like, where might we find these? And use that as kind of like an ongoing inquiry. Now, another kind of layer I want to add to this is Stanford History Education Groups, or SHEG for short. They have historical thinking skills. They have 4 of them. And I would add kind of this extra layer of historical thinking skills to our practice of critically analyzing power dynamics, because I think when we are specifically in history class looking at historical sources or modern sources, we want to consider a couple things that are really relevant for analyzing power dynamics. One of those is sourcing. So that's what they call it at SHEG, right? Considering the author's identities or positionality, right? So that's the part of sourcing that I think is relevant for analyzing power dynamics. So who is the author? What identities do they hold? Kind of what's their positionality given the society, maybe at the time, if we're looking at a historical source, and also currently modern day. And I would also look at a second historical thinking skill, which is contextualization. For this, I would consider the influence of what else is happening at the time. And I want to asterisk this very intentionally because I think there is a tendency, especially when we're talking about oppression in history, to say, hey, this was the time. Like, it's fine. It was the time. And I don't mean to say that super flippantly because I recognize that some people are saying that with kind of justice in mind ultimately. And they want to name that, of course, this is not something that we would accept today. I would argue for a fuller contextualization of what are the counter narratives that are happening at the time, because often when we look at oppression in history, this is not the narrative. There are many, many groups of people who in the time were saying this was not okay. So I think contextualization, yes, what else is happening at the time? Maybe there's a lot of oppression happening at the time. This was common. However, it is not the only narrative. And so we need to broaden our understanding of contextualization to think about counter narratives present at the time as well. And of course, and I think this is probably obvious to many of you listening to this podcast, right? Of course, we say we are looking at these pieces back in history and in time that this maybe was more popular than it is now in terms of language we use or actions we take. However, we absolutely understand that now and then these were incredibly offensive and problematic and oppressive, and we only learn about past oppression so that we better understand how to identify it in the present and how to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or if we see it happening, we are taking action against it because we know it is terrible and these are the terrible things that have happened in history and why this is bad. So I do think I just want to make that point very clear because I think it's important in how we frame that piece of contextualization to students. Okay. Then once you have kind of laid out either Iris Young's 5 Faces of Oppression framework and or NYU's culturally responsive scorecard kind of pieces and or Shegg's skills framework of sourcing and contextualization, then I would invite students to kind of consider, especially as we're talking about these latter two pieces, countering stereotypes and actively grappling with that idea of stereotypes and how to counter. I would engage with Facing History's set of lessons around stereotypes. It includes a resource, a cartoon called Street Calculus by Gary Trudeau that prompts students thinking about stereotypes in a way that feels productive. And so Facing History usually has some great resources. I'll link to these for you in the blog post so you can peruse them. But I would kind of develop that understanding of stereotype with students so that they can identify it, name it as such, and engage with like, how do we counter? And then I would also, I think one of the big things to kind of myth bust stereotypes or counter stereotypes is, as we were talking about, kind of making sure that we do have diverse and accurate representation and an inversion of power dynamics by centering the truth, by centering perspectives and stories and people who have been marginalized. And so part of that is just building up students' understanding of historical fact and current fact, and just providing them with lots of access to counter narratives, and counter narratives from the perspective of like curricula is normally centering people who are in power in their stories, in their historical sources, in their perspectives. And so we want to tip those scales and invert those scales and do the majority of kind of like what is often not centered. So one example, I'm just thinking of an example where instructional coach from a local district in Massachusetts reached out and said, hey, my teachers are teaching EL's curriculum, and EL has them reading Peter Pan. And there are some problematic, oppressive, racist representations of Indigenous peoples in Peter Pan. How do we deal with this? If we are going to engage with this text, like, how are we going to kind of like identify the stereotypes and myth bust the stereotypes? And my immediate reaction was, knowing that they are also using investigating history curriculum, which is Massachusetts state curriculum, for history class, social studies class, in that grade, they could pull some of those resources from history class to build a conceptual understanding and just kind of remind students in ELA class, hey, you learned about this. You learned about Indigenous peoples and local Indigenous peoples, and like, you know what are stereotypes and how to myth bust because you have that information in your history curriculum. Now, if you don't have it in your history curriculum, seek it out and, you know, kind of build it into your history curriculum. But like, one thing I'm immediately thinking of is the Abbey Museum's Thanksgiving true or false cards. They really bust up a lot of myths around Thanksgiving because students can see, like, here's kind of the concept that we think about and here's the actual truth. And they get to engage with these cards in an activity in the IH curriculum. But you could do that as a standalone, right? You could do that as just like here we're reading about kind of anti-Indigenous stereotypes. Like, let's bring in some facts about Indigenous nations, the multiplicity of Indigenous nations, and let's like bust up these myths, because we only bust up the myths with truth and fact. So I would kind of think about the ways that you can build up a background knowledge with your intentional selection of sources and factual information in your history class to kind of match up with ELA text if you're trying to analyze in novels. Okay. Final note here is that we have now done in this mini series on critically analyzing power dynamics around identity. We've done kind of race and nation, and we've also done gender. And I want to just make a quick pitch to frame for students. And again, this is going to look different in terms of the language you use at different age levels, but frame intersectionality for them. You can show an intersectionality wheel. I'll link to one of my favorites in the blog post. But I also think just saying something like, we can't separate out our race from our gender or our nation from our gender, right? Like, these are just who we are. We are all of the pieces, all of our identities at the same time. We can't just be one but not the other. So when we analyze, again, I'm thinking simplistically for our younger students, but when we analyze, we want to make sure that we're not just treating one without the other, right? Of course, at a higher level, we're talking about, you know, how the dynamics of being like a Black woman are different from just analyzing race and just analyzing gender separately. Like, it's like the nuance of the intersection. So I think, you know, your students, you know, the age they're at. And that's kind of like the continuum of what we want to understand. And so feel free to tap into the concept of intersectionality wherever you are. And of course, Kimberly Crenshaw's has amazing resources on this. She has a podcast. She has all of her texts out there in the world. Feel free to engage with those. As a final closing for this episode, we've done so much. Again, links are in the blog post. Another final link I will add to the blog post for you is my critical analysis resource bank, which is a slide deck of some common slides I like to put up for students to support their critical analysis. So anything from Goldie Muhammad's questions she poses in Cultivating Genius around criticality as she introduces that term, to the intersectionality wheel, I think is part of that, to different lenses that you could introduce and have up as posters in your class. So feel free to grab that and other resources be named in this episode at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/episode 204. And I'll be with you again next week for a final episode in this mini series where we dig into a framework on social class.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no strings attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.